Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen and I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how I found an agent. Before I get to that, a little bit of an introduction to stuff. All of the videos that I post here fall into two categories. There are late night talks. These are interviews and general chats I have with authors. The reason I call them late night talks is typically they happen in the evening, but also because they have adult language. So if that offends you, you don't like adult language, there you go. It may come up, it may not, but that was why I did it. The other kind of videos that I do are writing advice videos like this one. Mostly they focus on general writing advice. Some of them are to do specifically with traditional publishing. That's just because I have experience of traditional publishing. I haven't done self-publishing, so I can't talk about that. All of the writing advice videos and more of what I talk about, including this one, I've actually put into an ebook, which is available on Kindle. And if you're on Kindle Unlimited, it's also on there for free. So today I'm going to talk about how I found an agent. And if I did that in full, this video would probably be several hours long, so I'm not going to do that. But if you want the full story, it is also in the ebook. And the other thing I can't show you on here, which is in there, is my original letter that I sent to the agent. But more importantly, showing you what was in the letter is I got permission from my agent and we have the back and forth. So I sent the original letter, there's her thoughts in the book on what she liked about the book and also my letter. Then feedback as we talk back and forth about what she'd like to see in the book, right up to the point where I go and meet her. So all of that is in there. Also in the book is a lot of bad advice you should ignore. I've done some other videos, which I'll indicate here, about bad advice. And I don't just talk about it and say, don't look at it. I go try and dissect it and say, okay, what do people actually mean? And what are they trying to get at when they say that? So I've done some of those as well. So take a look at them, and those and more are in the ebook. So how did I find an agent? I have to kind of go back in time a little bit. I started writing when I was in my very early 20s. In 1999, this is now, going back 20 years, I wrote a novel. I was convinced it was really good. It was a fantasy novel because that was my first love. I've been reading science fiction and fantasy since I was a young age. Myths and legends. I went through the whole section in the local library and the school library. I read every fantasy book I could find. And at some point in my early 20s, I thought, I like this. This is really good. I love these stories. I'm gonna do it myself. I think I told my dad I was going to be a writer when I was about 12 or 13, and he said something along the lines of, well, that's nice, but you need to get, qualifications and another job too. And he was right, but in the end, I am now writing, so it all kind of worked out. But I wrote this first novel, this fantasy novel. I thought it was great. And then the internet was pretty much in its infancy. For those of you watching this video on YouTube, kind of seems impossible that that's where we are, but that's how it was back then. The only way you could get in contact with an agent back then was using the book called the Writers and Artists Handbook. It's still available now. It essentially is like a dictionary or catalogue of all of the reputable agents. There's a website for it too. I'll put a link in below, and you can order the physical book. And every year they look at all of the agents, look at all the agencies, and it lists who the agents are, but also contact details for them, and most important of all, what genres they're interested in. If you send a fantasy book to an agent that only handles romance, they'll just delete the email. They're just not interested. So that's really, really important. So back then, I wrote this first book, bought the Writers and Artists Handbook for that year, went through, found those that represented fantasy, and there weren't that many back then. There were probably 10, maybe, not even that, maybe 8. And what you had to do then was print out on paper the first 5,000 words or 5 chapters or whatever it might be, and put it in a self-addressed envelope. So you send it out to them, you pay the postage, and you put another envelope in there for the return of your material. At the very beginning, you could only query one agent at once. It was considered bad practice to send out to more than one agent. The other thing is, by sending it out in the post, you'd have a wait of anywhere between 3 and 6 months before you'd hear anything back. And what often happened then, back when I was doing it, was you'd get the return of your material because you knew that's what it was, because you your own handwriting on the envelope, and you get a little printed card that might have had your name written in, or it might just say, unfortunately on this occasion you've been successful, we're not interested in your material, blah blah blah. Sometimes you just got the material sent back and that was it. So, whilst waiting for a response on that first novel, I started working on the sequel, because that first novel was obviously going to get picked up. My first fantasy novel, it was brilliant. So I wrote the sequel, and I finished that when I was about 22, I think. So now I had 2 books in this series that was going to be 4 or 5 books or something like that. And I still was getting nowhere on that first book. I now had a sequel that nobody had read. My process then for editing the book hadn't changed too much to the present. What I did was go over the book over and over again, get friends to read it, print it out, go through a physical copy looking for inconsistencies and typos and spelling and grammar, and then type it all back up again and tweak it, and then start sending it out once I thought it was ready. So the way I've edited books over the last 20 years hasn't changed. So I didn't get anywhere with those 2 first fantasy novels. In the meantime, the internet had moved on a little bit. It was starting to develop. Also, they'd said you can now query more than one agent at once. You're allowed. It's no longer considered bad practice. I think I wrote another fantasy novel after that. I bought the new Writer's and Artist Handbook. I went through again, highlighted all of those that did fantasy. There were a couple of new names. Some had changed. I read their specifications and see exactly what they wanted and tailored the content to each of them, and sent out that fantasy novel and got nowhere. Nothing happened. There again, I got rejections coming in, and this went on for quite a few years. In the meantime, I was doing other things. I was writing screenplays. Some TV shows back then in the early 2000s and late 90s had an open door policy to the general public. You could write a script, send it in, as long as you filled out all the paperwork, that you weren't going to try and sue them or claim that it's stolen your idea, there's a possibility that they would make your show. So I did that with a friend. We wrote some scripts. I then did a book of short stories. I wrote a book of kind of vampire stories and things. I was getting very much into Anne Rice at that period, so I thought, this is quite interesting and different. Maybe I'll try this. So I wrote some of them. Some friends read the stories. They seemed to like them. But I didn't really think you could query short stories. And it's not the same now, where online you can send short stories out to people. You just couldn't do that back then. So I wasn't really sure what to do with it. After that, I wrote a science fiction novel. Did the same thing again, edited the book, had other friends read it, went through the next Writer's and Artist Handbook, filled out all the paperwork. You were still then sending stuff out in the post. You couldn't do anything by email or online. The internet had moved on a little bit, but it was still very much a physical world, a lot of paper going out the door, a lot of printing. After that, I wrote a Lovecraftian horror novel, something a bit different, more contemporary. I was reading a lot of Stephen King and Dean Koontz, and I thought, okay, I'll try something a bit different. Then I was starting to join some online forums. You could write a chapter or two or put it up online. Someone would then go over your book, give you feedback, and you do the same. So you had this kind of reciprocal thing. And I got really good feedback from there, and people seemed to like it. So I sent that out. I got lots of rejections again. The one thing I haven't talked about yet, which I should probably highlight, is during all of this time, the constantly being rejected really takes its toll. If you've ever put yourself out there, if you've ever put anything creative out in the public eye, some people like it, but there will always be some people that hate it, that just don't like it for whatever reason. You can't please everyone all of the time. However, when you're sending out a book and you're sending it to agents and you get rejection after rejection after rejection, of course it takes its toll. You feel like you're not any good. You feel like, well, why am I bothering to do this? And the worst thing about all of it is you get no feedback. You can send it out to your friends and family, and if they're honest and give you useful, critical feedback, that's great. But when you're sending it out to agents, and they're the kind of the industry gatekeepers, if you're going the traditional publishing route, back then, none of them gave you any feedback. You just got a standard printed thing. Very occasionally, I'd get one of those sort of printed postcards, and there'd be a line of text that someone had handwritten on, something like, "I quite like this." And that was worth its weight in gold. It showed that, all right, maybe there is something there, maybe I should keep going. But it was really tough to constantly being knocked back. all the time, and this is over years and over many, many books. It's really, really hard. I'm not going to pretend that it was easy. And the other thing is, it's not just me that's suffering, because when I'm having a tough time, your friends and your family have to cope with that as well. They have to listen to you moan on, and you know, they can be compassionate and they can be understanding and they can be sympathetic, but if it keeps happening, it's hard. It's really hard for them to maintain that same level of sympathy. I understand that. If you're not a writer, it's difficult to kind of get your head around. You're putting so much of yourself into the work. You spend so many hours, and so much of your time and so much emotion and thought goes into this, for someone to read it and just go, nah, I don't like it. Or they just say it's rubbish. And that's the worst thing about reviews. Never read reviews online. Never. Because someone can just say it's rubbish. They don't care that you've spent 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years on a book, however many hours you've spent pouring into this, how much research you might have done. They don't care. They can just say it's rubbish. And you can't write back to them. You can't have a discussion. Don't read reviews. That's just a little extra thing I wanted to say. So it was really, really difficult. And many times I thought about giving up. Many times I wanted to stop writing, but I would take a break, couple of weeks, couple of months, but I always came back. I always thought, okay, I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna write another book. In 2009, 2010, thereabouts, I wrote a contemporary thriller with a very small bit of supernatural stuff in there, sort of like a Dean Koontz style book. Something where there's a person in danger. I wrote this book really, really quickly. I really enjoyed it. The text was very tight. It was very pacey. Showed it to other people, got very positive feedback. And then an event came along. Now, throughout all this period, which I haven't mentioned so far, is I was attending events in the UK, which is where I live. Science fiction fantasy events predominantly. I'd go to these events, I'd listen to other authors talk on panels, I'd listen to editors, I'd listen to agents because they started coming to events back then. And I'd ask questions if I could, if they allowed the audience to do that. And I was constantly learning names, trying to glean as much information as I could. So then in 2010-11, York University in the UK was hosting the first ever Writers' Festival. This was where you had to pay to go to the event. Many of them had a very small charge. This one was like a kind of boot camp in a way, where you'd spend the whole weekend there. It was off season for the university, so you'd stay in halls of residence that the students would normally be in. They'd give you all your meals, and throughout the course of a weekend, I think it ran Friday to Sunday, you'd go to panels, you'd listen to people talk, but you could also sit down with 2 agents and have one-to-one sessions. You had to send in your book early, you had to pay a bit extra for this as well. And they'd give you feedback on the first, there again, 5 chapters or 10,000 words, or whatever it might have been, I can't remember. And I thought this was an opportunity that I couldn't resist. I should really go and do this. The problem was, it was really quite expensive. So I talked it over with my partner, and we decided I should go for it. Paid the money, I went along. During the process, for whatever reason, one of the agents had to cancel. I think they were ill, so they couldn't attend. So I sat down with one agent, and I got reasonable feedback. On the other meeting, I actually sat down with a published author, and I think it was her agent that was supposed to come and couldn't make it. And she had read the book, and she gave me feedback. And she said, this is really good. I really like this. I think you've got something here. And I felt absolutely like $1 million. I thought, oh, I'm on my way. This is it. I've got great feedback. She's published. She knows what she's talking about. And she said, I'm going to show this to my agent. I like this, and I think they will like it too. I walked around trying not to be too smug, thinking, this is it. I'm gonna do it. I'm finally getting there. And I felt brilliant. Sent it out to her agent, read it, came back and said, it's okay, but there's something missing. It's not quite right. Other feedback from other agents that I sent back, it was okay, and there again, it didn't happen. And I was absolutely crushed. I thought I'd done it. I thought I got so close. I thought I was gonna make it. And I didn't. It was another knockback. So after that, I returned to my first love, which was fantasy. And I'd been reading fantasy books throughout this whole period, and I noticed some of them, not all of them, had this idea where they almost seemed embarrassed to be fantasy books. And there's still a little bit of this that exists. Not too much, but it was a lot worse back then. Before science fiction and fantasy, particularly fantasy like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, all this kind of weird magical stuff. Before all of that, you had to kind of, some people did fantasy, and then once you're a couple of hundred pages in, they'd sneak in some of the more weird stuff. Before, you could read almost like a historical novel with just people with swords and shields. And, I'm not disparaging those kind of books. I love some of them. I read whether it's Bernard Cornwell or someone else, and they're great. But some fantasy authors were doing it in a sort of sneaky way, and I didn't like that. I wanted fantasy that was in your face straight away. You knew that this was a fantasy book. So I wrote a fantasy book with overt magic and wizards, with non-human races, with weirdness creeping around the corners, with supernatural stuff, all of this stuff that I loved most of all. I wrote the kind of book that I wanted to read that I wasn't seeing enough of. I went through the same process. I edited the book, I changed the font, I re-edited it again, I had friends read it, I printed it out, went through it line by line. Now by this stage, the internet had grown up again. You could now query agents online. Social media was becoming a thing. Twitter existed for the first time, but it was fairly different to it is now. It was a lot quieter. Agents were online as well. You could follow them on social media. You could email them your book. You no longer had to print it out. So in 2012 and then late 12, early 2013, I sent the first few chapters of this book out. I'd done my homework, I'd looked up the agents, I'd found those who represented fantasy, I'd read very carefully their submission guidelines, I'd gone over my letter over and over and over and polished it. My synopsis, there again, went over it and over it and over it until I could pretty much recite it. I found one agent that I liked, I thought, right, I'll send it out to her first, see what happens, and then send it out to more. I sent it out to that agent and tried to forget about it. And this was a trilogy, and I started working on the next book and planning it and making notes and that kind of thing. A few weeks later, I got an email saying, I really like this, or it was even shorter than that. It was just, can you please send the full manuscript? Because some agents have had this happen. I've spoken to my agent about this, and people have sent in the first 5 chapters, 6 chapters, whatever it might be, and when they say, can I read the rest of the book? And the person says, oh, well, I haven't written it yet. Which is a horrible thing to do. Never do that. Always finish the book. So I sent off the full manuscript and tried to forget about it. Because over the course of attending events and listening to agents and other published writers talk, I'd heard some of them say, sometimes you can get an agent and the first book just doesn't work, or for whatever reason, when they read the rest of the novel, it's not as polished, it's not as well developed as those first 5 chapters. So a request to read the full manuscript isn't a guarantee that it was going to go anywhere. So I was excited, but I was trying to temper my level of excitement. A few weeks later, I got an email back. I was thinking it was going to be months, but it was actually quite a short period of time. And this is where I can't really talk too much about. I had feedback from her and we went back and forth a little bit on my letter and on what she was after and this kind of stuff. So it's in the ebook, which I've mentioned. You can check it out there. She shared her thoughts on my covering letter and on the book, what she liked, what she thought needed developed, and asked if I was willing to travel to London, where she was based, to sit and have a chat and talk through the book and what her thoughts were on developing it. So I went down to London, I met with her, we talked through, she had a number of different ideas, and I really liked them. I didn't disagree with any of the changes that she was suggesting. I all thought they made sense to me. I then spent the next year editing the book with my agent. She'd given me this feedback, I went through, made these changes, sent them back to her. She had some more feedback, I think I did another draft, but I did this over the course of a year. And after that year, she read it again and said, I now think it's ready to go out on submission. It went out to one publisher initially, so they had the sort of preempt. They could read it for 7 days and either make an offer in that period, otherwise it would go out to multiple publishers and multiple editors would have a chance to read it. And within that 7-day period, I remember it very, very specifically. I was driving home from work, my mobile phone rang, I didn't answer it, but I thought no one normally rings me at this time, it's a bit unusual, so I pulled off into the car park of this particular store, and checked my phone, and I noticed that I had a missed call from my agent. I was so excited, and I thought, this has got to be some good news surely. So I rang her back, and she said, they want to make an offer on your book. I'll never forget that moment. This was the culmination of years and years of work. So many rejections, so many knockbacks, and suddenly I've now got an agent and a publisher who wants my book, and they're interested in it. And I was absolutely over the moon. I was so excited driving home. I couldn't wait to tell other people. And that novel became this one, Battle Mage. And it's the first novel of my first trilogy. I should say I then spent another year editing the book with Orbit whilst also working on books 2 and 3, because they released them in an advanced publication schedule. So every 6 months they came out. So within 12 calendar months my first trilogy was out, but they gave me more time up front to work on the other books so I can maintain that 6 monthly schedule. But that was a very busy period whilst working on 3 books at the same time at different stages, and it was a bit crazy. But I was absolutely amazed and delighted, and it was worth it. All of the work, all of the time, all of the rejections, all of the hours, all of the kind of suffering, all of the tears and anguish, all of the getting sympathy from people and then wearing it out because I was constantly driven by this need to write, that I just had to do this. I couldn't stop. It's like a weird compulsion almost. But the fact that I just kept trying over and over and over again. And Battle Mage was published in September 2015. And since then I've gone on to write other books for Orbit, and now I've got more books coming out with another publisher in 2021. So weirdly, that's quite a short version, even though I've been talking for a very long time. If you've got any other questions about how I found an agent, working with a publisher, any of the process or any of that kind of stuff, get in touch and let me know. Please subscribe to the channel, post some comments. If you want to buy the ebook, that would be great. It's got a lot more advice in there. And this will be the last video for this year, but I'll be back next year with some new stuff. So take care, and I'll see you soon.